Hello, welcome to Chess Master Journey. Hope all of you are doing great out there. So today we're going to look at another king's pawn opening, which is known as the Alekhine defense. So let's look at the Alekhine defense position. As usual, king side, e4 and f6. Okay, this position is known as the Alekhine defense. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the possible moves that we have under this defense and what are the variations we have here. So let's start. So let's start with for white. First move, maybe we can use the e pawn itself and push it to e5 square. And so in this position, since the pawn is after the knight, so let's say the knight is moved to d5 square here. Okay, so this is known as the Alekhine defense normal variation. Okay, this is the normal variation. So let's further continue the game. So to continue the game, let's say the white now, and we move the d pawn to d4 square. And for the black, we continue with the d pawn to d6 square. And for the further move, the white, we use the g knight to move to the f3 square. Okay, as you all can see this position here, now this is known as the modern variation of Alekhine defense. So this is the modern variation. Okay, let's just continue the game more. So now let's say we use the black bishop to move to g4 square. So black bishop to g4 square. Now we are in the modern variation main line. So this is how the modern variation main line position looks like. Okay, now to continue the game, we use the white bishop to e2 square. And now we can use the black pawn, e pawn to e6 square. To develop more the position for white, you can go for the castling. Okay, then for the black, we can use the black bishop to e7 square. And for the white, you can perhaps move the c pawn to c4 square. So this is how you can continue your game, develop the pieces under the Alekhine defense normal variation and also modern variation. Okay, so let's take a look at the next move. So let's say just now we move the knight to d5. So let's say we don't move to d5, let's say we go back to g8. Okay, now in this position, so g8. Okay, now this is known as the Brooklyn variation. So this is known as the Brooklyn variation. So to further continue the game, we can use the d pawn to d4 square. And to further develop, you can use the black d pawn to d6 square. And for the white, we can use the knight to f3 square, knight to f3 square. And here in this position, the black pawn can go after the white pawn, so dx e5. And then the white knight after the black pawn and x e5. And now in this position for the black, perhaps since you all can see, there's many pieces of undeveloped pieces from the black side. So we have to move the pieces here. So we use the knight to d7 square, and then we can use the bishop or also the knight, because since this knight is attacking, so what we can do is we can move the white knight to f3 square. And now for the black turn, we develop the g knight to f6 square, g knight to f6 square. So this is how you can further develop the pieces under the Brooklyn variation. So let's see further just now. So let's say we in this position in nd5 we used to move the c pawn to c4 square. Okay, now in this position it is known as the Alekhine defense 2-pawn attack. This is known as the 2-pawn attack. So to further continue the game, the knight, you either can move to b6 square or to b4 square. So let's say we move the knight to b6 square, knight to b6 square, and now in this position we can develop the pawn, the d pawn or the c pawn also, but let's say we use the d pawn, so d to d4 square. And for the black, you can develop the d pawn to d6 square. And in this position, the white pawn goes after the black pawn, ex d6. Okay, and now this is known as the Alekhine defense of exchange variation, as there is some capturing occurring. So this is exchange variation. Okay, so in this position you can either use this c pawn to capture or e pawn to capture. So let's say we use the e pawn to capture. So ex d6. Now for the white, you can develop the minor piece, which is a knight to c3 square, and then the bishop to e7 square. Now for the white bishop to d3 square. So this is how you can develop the pieces here if you use the c4 pawn to continue the game for the Alekhine defense. Okay, so let's say we don't move in this position, we don't move the c pawn, we move the knight to c3 square. Okay, this is known as the Alekhine defense Samish attack. Okay, so to continue the game, so the black goes after the white knight, so nx c3, and then the pawn, you can either use the b pawn or d pawn to capture the knight. So let's say in this position we use the d pawn to capture the c3 knight. And further to continue the game, we can use the d pawn to d6, and for the white you can use the knight to f3 square, and then the black knight to c6 square, and we can move the bishop to b5 square, bishop to b5 square. So this is how you can develop your pieces under the Samish attack. Okay, right. Now let's take a look at some other positions. So we already look at here, we already move to this position, G8, and what else we can go is we can go here to E4 square. So let's say knight to E4 square. Okay, now this position is known as the Mokle-Mbembe variation. Okay, so now for this to continue the game, you move the D pawn to D3 square. Then knight, since there's an attack, so we can knight go to C5 square. Then you can bring the pawn further, push the pawn further up to D4 square. And now the knight has to move to some other place. Maybe you can go for A4, or can go to E6 position. So let's say we choose to go to E6 position. And then in this position, to continue the game, we can push the F pawn to F4 square. And then the G pawn to G6 square. For the white, you can use the D pawn to attack the knight. So D5, as you can see, the center pawn is going up. So the knight over here either can choose to go to the C5 square or also to G7 square. So let's say we use the knight to go to G7 square and G7. And then for the white, you can develop the minor pieces which are undeveloped. So we can go for the knight to F3 square. And the D pawn, for the black, D pawn to D6 square. So this is how you can develop your pieces under this position. If you move the knight earlier to E4. Yeah. Okay, done. Next again we will refresh on the Alekhine defense position, which is the E4 and NF6. Now we choose to move the knight now. Knight to C3 square. So knight to C3 square. Then to continue the game, so the D pawn is pushed to D5 square. Okay, now this position, so this variation is known as the Scandinavian variation. Okay, to continue the game, we can move the E pawn to E5 square. So you use the F knight to go to the D7 position. And then for the white, you can push your D pawn to D4 square. And for the black, you can use the C pawn to C5 square. For the white, you can go for the F pawn to F4 square. So in this position, so the black C pawn goes after the D pawn, so Cx D4. And then we use the knight, develop the knight to B5 square. Develop the knight to B5 square. And now the black knight to C6 square. Further, you can use you can develop the another knight, G knight to F3 square. Now you can probably, since the king is exposed, so the black can maybe move the queen to A5 square and check. Okay, so in this position, you can either use the bishop to block the check or also the queen to block the check. Okay, let's say we use the queen to block the check. So this is how you can some of the ideas how you can develop the game under this Scandinavian variation. Okay, now. So we move to the next position. Let's say we don't choose to move the D pawn, but we choose to move the E pawn. So let's say we move the E pawn to E5 square. Now in this position, this is already changed to some other opening, which is the Vienna game of the Falkenberg variation. Okay, so this is it becomes the another type of variation and opening. So in this position, how you can move the game is you can go for the G pawn to G3 square, and you can move the D pawn to D5 square. So this is already become the Mises variation of the Vienna game. So in this position, the white pawn goes after the black pawn ex d5, and also now the knight goes after the pawn and next d5. Okay, this is how it goes. So from Alekhine defense, it is changed to the Vienna game. Okay, if you move the e5. So now let's go to some other moves other than the knight. Okay, just now we move the knight to c3 square, right? So now we'll choose the d pawn to d3 square. D pawn to d3 square. This position, as you all can see, it is known as the Maxi Variation of the Alekhine defense. So to continue the game, okay, what are the possible moves or what are the ideas you can apply here is we can go for the d pawn to d5 square, d pawn to d5 square. And then we can develop the knight to d2 square, knight to d2 square. Then you can go for the black, you can go for the e pawn to e5 square. Then knight to g knight to f3 square. Okay, so this is how you can develop your pieces under the Maxi variation. Okay, next let's take a look at some other positions you can try is you can use the bishop. So bishop to c4 square. Now this bishop to c4 square, it is known as the Critic variation. Okay, to how you can further develop the pieces is now there's a free white pawn, so the black knight can go after the pawn and next e4. And now in this position, so bishop goes after the pawn and have a check. So bx f7. So this is known as the Critic gambit of the Alekhine defense. So in this position, king goes after the bishop, and now here for the white, queen goes to h5 square check. So now king goes back to g8 square, and then queen moves to the d5 square, another check, and now you can use the e pawn to block the check. E pawn to e6 square, and the queen goes after the knight, so qx e4. So this is quite an interesting gambit. So this is how you can play under the Critic gambit. Okay, so next we can look at another one. So let's say we used to move the c pawn to c4 square. So this is also it has changed from Alekhine defense to an English opening. So maybe you can, if you want to further the game, you can move the e pawn to e6 square, then the knight to c3 square, and then the d pawn to d5 square. And now here you can go for the capture, or if you don't want to capture, you just can make it move in front, so to e5 square. So this is how you can dealt the game, but now it is changed from the Alekhine defense to an English opening. This is known as the English opening under Mikana's Carl's variation. Okay, so that's all under the Alekhine defense lesson. So as you all know, we had seen pretty number of variation under this Alekhine defense. So just to remind you all out there, just remember that chess is like a journey of life. We have to open all the possibilities that we have to attain our goal, which is to checkmate. So see you all in the next lesson. Thank you and bye.